We're at the memorial for the 3 Muslims who were just killed earlier this week in the University of North Carolina. North Carolina Chapel Hill, and we just witnessed a memorial service for that. So, could you tell me a little bit about what brings you here today and what issues this brings up for you?
So, one of the main concepts that all Muslims share is that we are connected by a global community. So it's called the Ummah, Muslim Ummah. So it doesn't matter if these 3 folks who unfortunately passed away in North Carolina a few days back, it doesn't matter if I've never met them before. They were Muslim, I'm Muslim. Those 2 women were my sisters, that brother was my brother. So I'm doing this out of a service like I would for any biological brother or sister, or any Muslim brother or sister. And if not in Islam, then in humanity. They are my brothers and sisters in humanity. And unfortunately, the way they died compounded with the type of people they were. And if you don't know the type of people they were, there is a lot of evidence on social media currently to show the type of people they were. Just
they're very generous because they were. I forget his name, but Deah was planning on going to Syria to provide dental supplies and free dental care to Syrian refugees. He was also working in his own community to provide health care to poor black communities.
Exactly. And that's a duty on every Muslim. You can argue that it's a duty on all human beings, of course it is, but it's definitely a duty on all Muslims especially. So he was fulfilling that to the fullest extent, and because of that, to go back to saying that because he was a Muslim brother, compounded with the fact that he was actually a shining star in the human community, in the Muslim community, the fact that his light was extinguished as violently as it was, and as abruptly as it was, has far-reaching effects, I would say. And Muslims die all the time, human beings die all the time, tragedy, all over the world. You read about it in your news feeds. And there's vigils held all the time, and unfortunately, between all the stuff that happens and what's going on with the world, sometimes you find yourself not being able to make it. But this one in particular, it was a lot more personal this time.
So that's not only because they're part of what you see as a broader Muslim community, but also because their lives were so such shining examples. And
exactly. Had they not been Muslim, I would still be. I would think I would still be affected by what had happened, just because of the abruptness and the violence that the way they were extinguished, the way their lights were blown out. That. It makes it very personal. The fact that they were Muslim on top of that, and they share the same religion that I have, just hits it closer to home.
And one of the things I found about this was that there seemed to be a lot of controversy about how the mainstream media treated this case, because at first it was ignored, then there was a large sort of social media upstream to sort of bring attention, and a lot of the coverage has sort of been almost trying to minimize it down to just being a parking dispute when this person had a history of sort of harassing this particular family. And how does that sort of strike you as a Muslim and your portrayal in the mainstream media?
So, I mean, unless the Muslims are portrayed as the enemy or the monsters under the bed, we don't really get too much media on our side. And the media that we do get, especially in this case, is extremely reductive. Like you mentioned, a parking dispute. You know what? The parking dispute may have been the conclusion of what happened that night, but definitely wasn't the underlying theme. I'm just speculating right now, being here in Edmonton, Alberta, and talking about an incident that happened in North Carolina, a place where I've never been, to people I've never met.
Yes.
But it's the way the discourse has been going with the Muslim community the last 10 years, 15 years, 25 years. You can't convince me that there was no underlying factor going on with that. And then when I say underlying factor, if I can be a little bit more specific, I'm talking about in the realm of hate crime against that minority being the Muslims in North Carolina. Back to how the media portrays, and their coverage of this incident for 2 days after the incident. I think this is the third day. All the information I had gotten from this has been through social media, only because I'm a Muslim and I have links to the Muslim accounts, and it goes through the Muslim wire. So I hear about this a lot quicker than I saw on the news, CBC, Canadian news stations, and of course American news stations. So I heard about it a lot quicker and a lot faster and a lot more in-depthly through social media than I did actually through legitimate news sources, until about today and yesterday. Late yesterday and early today is when news sources started really picking up the story and really delving into the topic, into the situation, getting a lot more details as to what happened that night. What they're jumping on right now is, of course, the single isolated incident, parking dispute, and the man has mental issues, and that seems to be that their safety net. Because had this, and this is what really, you know, I'm a fairly level-headed individual, but I mean, it's hard not to get frustrated when I know. And you know, and the whole world knows that if it had been reversed, if a man with no mustache and a beard wearing a kufi had shot 3 bright, youthful, innocent non-Muslims, doesn't have to be Christian, doesn't have to be atheist, just non-Muslims, our news feeds would have lit up with terror cells, terror talk. The term terrorist would be a headline, starting headline for it. You know this. This is fact. It's not speculation. So it's hard not to be frustrated, knowing that had it been reversed, the news would have portrayed it extremely differently. So it is really frustrating.
What would you like Edmontonians to consider when they think about discourses on Islam and violence?
So, being Canadian-born, growing up in Canada, never going to the Middle East, actually until I was about 16, 17, I had this idea of what the Arab world was, and it was needless to say, it was a very ignorant and very uneducated idea. Me being a Muslim, my father being an Arab, I had a very low standard as to what it was, because I had been raised in Canada, and because what I knew of the Middle East was through news channels, and was through the violence, and through the issues and the civil wars and the things that affect the Muslim world, and especially Muslims in the Middle East. So if I suffered from that ignorance, being a Muslim, being the son of an Arab, I can only imagine what people who have no perspective in the religion of Islam, no perspective of that area of the world except through what they see through the media, I can only imagine their level of ignorance and their level of lacking education when it comes to viewing us, and when it comes to just knowing us as human beings. What a Muslim wants to do, you know, you go over to Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or Jordan or Saudi Arabia, and you go and you interview a teenager, and they just want to do what regular teenagers do. It's a universal understanding. It is a universal. The teenager from the United States has more in common than a teenager from Saudi Arabia. They have more in common with each other than they do with their own governments. It's the governments, and I'm not trying to get political or anything like that, but the people of all these nations, the human beings that populate Canada, United States, South America, Middle East, have more in common with each other.
The human beings of the world have a common unity over and above the conflicts of nation states.
Yeah. What you want to do on a Saturday is probably what somebody in Lebanon or Jordan or Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Afghanistan, what they want to do on a Saturday. Your pastimes are no different than their pastimes. Unfortunately, we have to now, and the Muslim community in the West now has to deal with being responsible or being held accountable for things that one individual can just ruin the party for everybody. And unfortunately, what happened at Parliament Hill a few months back, I don't know the exact date, with that gentleman and what happened a week previous to that event, you have now the Muslim community having to wake up, turn the news on, sigh, put on their Muslim garb, go stand in front of the in front of the cameras and say, "I am sorry, he does not represent my religion, he does not do this, he does not do that, she does not do this, they do not represent our religion as a whole," every time. And it's getting exhausting. It's getting exhausting. Nobody expects, after this incident that happened at Chapel Hill, nobody expects white people, and I use that term not as a derogatory, I just use that as a way to further this conversation. Nobody expects white people, or some reports are saying that he was atheist. Nobody's expecting white people, atheists, or frankly people who park in parking stalls to apologize for this man's behavior and his actions. Nobody's framing it as extremist parkers or extremist drivers having to apologize on behalf of this man's extreme parking ideology. Nobody's expecting that. It would be ridiculous for me to ask for that. Yet, when something happens at Parliament Hill or any of the other terrorist-labeled attacks, I, as an individual, as somebody who prays 5 times a day, who goes to the mosque, now have to stand up, stand in front of a camel, or talk to people not of my community and say, "Yeah, actually, no, I'm not a part of that. That's a fringe." And I have no stakes in that, but now I have to represent that. It's come on the burden has fallen on my shoulders. I have to say, no, that does not represent my religion. It is not the religion that my mother follows, that my father follows, that my grandparents have, that the nieces and nephews follow, and my little cousins follow. That is not the religion that we all follow, yet I have to stand here and apologize for it. And that's what's happening now. That's where we're at right now. And I believe that is perpetuated and is exacerbated by the media's portrayal of the Muslim community in Canada, United States, North America, the West.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to add?
I'm very grateful for being a Canadian. I have more ties to my Canadian roots than I do my Lebanese roots. My father's Lebanese. I really appreciate the country that I live in. And you know what? Majority of Muslims, especially the Muslim immigrants, really see Canada as a lifeboat, as a savior, as a sanctuary, as salvation. If you ask anybody, you just have to ask. If you ask any of the immigrants, or any of the refugees, or any of the folks who have escaped the unfortunate situations that they came from, they are very grateful to be Canadian. And I don't think a lot of people know that about Muslims. We are very grateful to be Canadian. We have loyalty to the country of Canada, and that any traitor of Canada is a traitor to us as well, especially to us.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.